I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is this one here, the Philippines, why it is choosing U.S. destruction over Chinese construction. And this is a familiar theme to anyone who has been following my work. I have constantly made the connection between U.S. foreign policy, transforming Ukraine into a battering ram to use against Russia in a self-destructive proxy war, and what the U.S. is currently attempting to recreate here in Asia, where I am based, and in particular, the Southeast Asian country of the Philippines, also the Chinese island province of Taiwan. And I've often talked about how the US is trying to create and shape proxies elsewhere in the region, including here in Thailand, where I am based, just as the US has fashioned more or less all of Eastern Europe as a battering ram against Russia, but using Ukraine specifically in this proxy war. They're doing a very similar process here in Asia. In Eastern Europe, it is to encircle and contain Russia. Here in Asia, it is to encircle and contain China. It is being done entirely at the cost of these nations being used as US proxies, entirely against their own interests, even if the US is capable of convincing the public that somehow it is in their interest. So I'm going to read through this article, and as I always do, I will add information when and if necessary. And I will begin. While the ongoing conflict in Ukraine continues to dominate headlines, occasionally news stories surface regarding growing tensions in the Asia-Pacific region as well. Driven primarily by the US, these headlines often include the proxies Washington is using to stir up a Ukraine-style conflict in the region. Among these proxies is the Southeast Asian archipelago nation of the Philippines. The South China Morning Post. So let's look at these sources. This article here. China, Philippines ties on brink of total breakdown, unpacking the collapse. And you see defend PH waters, defend Philippine waters, China out. And so who are these people? And does this really reflect the best interests of the Philippines? Because even though people will claim that that is subjective, I would say that it is objective. You can objectively tell what is in somebody's best interest, even if they think otherwise. You can tell, such as someone drinking super glue, they're going to die, even if they think that that's going to somehow give them superpowers. It's just going to super kill them. And the people in the Philippines who think stopping cooperation with their largest trade partner, China, and instead waging a war on the United States' behalf, somehow that's in their best interest. All it's actually going to do is destroy the Philippines. It's going to destroy their country. It's going to destroy themselves, sometimes in a very literal sense. They will be destroyed in the process. Ask Ukraine. So let's talk about this article, unpacking the collapse between Philippines-Chinese relations. How did this happen? Did this happen because of something China did, or was there a change in government in the Philippines and it's now a US-backed client regime that is destroying the Philippines itself? Which do you think it will be? So this article would claim to provide an explanation as to why once constructive ties between Beijing and Manila have deteriorated into what may possibly become a destructive confrontation. The article describes how concrete pillars of a rail project being built with China have since been torn down, and instead construction in the Philippines now consists of military bases to be used to point missiles at China. So why are you pointing missiles at China when China was the one providing you with desperately needed modern infrastructure? You have to understand that the Philippines has, for example, just to give you a sense here, has a larger population than Thailand, and yet its GDP is smaller. Its economy is, relative to Thailand's, extremely backwards and undeveloped. Thailand has first-rate infrastructure. The first high-speed rail line is already under construction. It will connect to China directly through Laos, who already has a functioning high-speed rail line. The Philippines is behind by years, if not decades. The rest of Southeast Asia, with few exceptions, the Philippines is behind, despite having tremendous human resources and the potential to use those human resources and natural resources to have a first-rate economy, to have first-rate infrastructure. But that can only happen if you engage in development and construction rather than proxy war and self-destruction. The article claims, what began as a story of infrastructure cooperation has morphed into an epic tale of betrayal and confrontation, the once chummy relationship between Manila and Beijing giving way to escalating geopolitical rivalry. And even though this is called the South China Morning Post, it is extremely pro-Western in tone. And if you look at the authors of this particular article, you will just see how transparently pro-West they are, and their headlines and their stories and their narratives are. So please keep that in mind. This would be like me reading from CNN, Reuters, or the BBC. It is that bias in favor of the West. As with many pro-Western accounts of growing Chinese-Philippines tensions, the article omits the political transition from the administration of President Rodrigo Duterte to that of now President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., and how the independent foreign policy of President Duterte was overwritten by the pro-Washington policy of President Marcos Jr. Maritime disputes treated as minor bilateral concerns to be worked out with Beijing under President Duterte were escalated into a growing conflict under President Marcos Jr., with U.S. backing meant to serve as the very pretext to cancel and literally tear down joint Chinese-Philippine projects and replace it with the expansion of the U.S. military's footprint across the Philippines. And I will get into just how bad this actually is, because as bad as it sounds, it is so much worse when you consider the historical relationship the United States has had with the Philippines. Beijing claims growing tensions specifically over the second Thomas Shoal, a mostly submerged shoal in the South China Sea, followed the breaking of an agreement with China to suspend Filipino resupply missions to a grounded World War II ship at the shoal during the Duterte administration. Under the Marcos Jr. administration, resupply missions resumed, with Manila claiming no such agreement was ever made. So when they talk about betrayal, this is actually what they're referring to in reality versus the betrayal they claim China is somehow guilty of. China has since released audio recordings, so also from the pro-Western South China Morning Post. South China Sea Philippine admiral at center of New Deal saga breaks silence on alleged pact with Beijing. So he absolutely, because China knew they were going to renege eventually on this agreement, they recorded the conversation a Philippine admiral had with Chinese representatives regarding this agreement. They have it on tape because they knew they were going to do this. And so when they denied that the deal was ever made, they released the audio recording. And then the Philippines complained that this was recorded without their consent. That is their argument. Not that it's falsified or doctored, but that it was done without their consent. That is their complaint, that their conniving has been exposed by this recorded conversation. So China has since released audio recordings of the agreement, causing Manila to backpedal and claim the agreement was not official. Does this sound familiar? This is what the United States always does. They make agreements with, whether it was the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation, they may have made agreements with China, sometimes officially in writing, signed and dated, but also unofficially, and they end up violating all of these agreements. They end up unilaterally withdrawing from arms control treaties. Also, again, based on entirely fabricated pretexts. That is the US, and that is the proxies that the US uses around the globe. This is how they do business. The question becomes, why has Manila decided to choose confrontation with Beijing rather than cooperation? And the answer is Manila did not choose between confrontation and cooperation. Washington did. That was a decision made in Washington. We always hear about how the US is defending freedom, democracy, sovereignty, the world over. Every nation is a sovereign nation that should have the ability to self-determine their destination, and yet everything being determined in the Philippines right now is actually first determined in Washington. It is then carried out by an obedient administration in Manila. Washington made the decision, far from defending Philippine sovereignty from Chinese aggression. Growing tensions between China and the Philippines is a direct result of the Philippines' own sovereignty already being stripped from it through its political capture by Washington. The U.S., through the National Endowment for Democracy and adjacent organizations, has invested for decades millions of dollars a year to influence and intervene in the internal political affairs of nations around the globe, including the Philippines, to shift the respective foreign policies of targeted nations from serving their own best interests to serving Washington's. U.S. government-funded media outlets in the Philippines like Rappler. Rappler, you have to understand this media organization you always see cited in the Western media. Rappler is funded by the U.S. government through the National Endowment for Democracy. Worse than that, the founder of Rappler, Maria Ressa, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, that should tell you everything you need to know about the necessity of constructing legitimacy for her, because she lacks it in reality. She joins World Movement for Democracy at National Endowment for Democracy as chairperson. So she's receiving money from the NED to run her propaganda front, and she also is literally an employee of the NED, chairing the World Movement for Democracy, and that is her picture on the NED's official website. That is how bad and how transparent it actually is. So let me continue. U.S. government-funded media outlets in the Philippines like Rappler, funded by Maria Ressa, a dual U.S.-Philippine citizen, former CNN employee. Go look it up. It is in her biography. She's very proud of that. Who also works directly for the NED, as I just showed you, as well as receiving funding from the NED, have an entire section on their homepage dedicated to news about what they call the West Philippine Sea. So when you see countries and political opposition groups renaming entire oceans and seas and countries and parts of countries, this is usually US-funded separatism in some cases, US-backed terrorists in Xinjiang, China, renaming Xinjiang as East Turkestan, and in this case, they're trying to reinforce Filipino claims over this part of the South China Sea by just renaming it the West Philippine Sea. No one on Earth recognizes as the West Philippine Sea. This is a completely constructed concept solely to serve U.S. interests in provoking conflict, escalating these ordinary disputes into an all-out conflict. The U.S.-funded media platform fits into a wider strategy of manipulating Philippine public perception regarding China, specifically to poison the Philippine public against China. And this is the same policy the U.S. Funded in Ukraine, poisoning Ukrainians against Russia, despite so many linguistic, historical, cultural similarities between Ukrainians and Russia, Ukraine having been part of Russia historically. They still manage, with enough money and time, you can poison anyone against anyone else. And that is what the US, that is what they do. That's what they did in Ukraine. That is what they're doing in the Philippines. In this specific instance, Rappler and others aim at convincing the public that China poses a threat to Philippine sovereignty and territorial integrity, while convincing the Philippine people to allow U.S. military basing on their own territory and to redirect more public funds from development and infrastructure, including the infrastructure China was helping them build, to be spent instead on military spending, including on facilities for U.S. troops to operate out of and on U.S. weapons sold to the Philippines itself. Recently, Reuters exposed other instances of the U.S. government deliberately and maliciously manipulating the Philippine public with the intent of poisoning them against China. So you may remember me going over this article. This is from Reuters. Pentagon ran secret anti-vax campaign to undermine China during pandemic. In its investigative report by Reuters, Pentagon ran secret anti-vax campaign to undermine China during pandemic. It admits the clandestine operation aimed to sow doubt about the safety and efficacy of vaccines and other life-saving aid that was being supplied by China, a Reuters investigation found. Through phony internet accounts meant to impersonate Filipinos, the military's propaganda efforts, U.S. military, their propaganda efforts morphed into an anti-vax campaign. Social media posts decried the quality of face masks, test kits, and the first vaccine that would become available in the Philippines, China's Sinovac inoculation. Reuters, citing U.S. officials and healthcare experts, admitted that the campaign wasn't based on genuine public health, perspective, but simply aimed to drag China through the mud and endangered the lives of the Philippine public in the process. While Washington has convinced the Philippine public through U.S. government-funded media that China poses a threat to the Philippines, in actuality, it is the U.S. government itself demonstrably harming the Philippines and its people through what are admitted deliberate lies. It's campaigned to poison the Philippines against China, resulting in canceled public infrastructure projects in exchange for a US-backed military buildup, threatening to drag the country into armed conflict to fight Washington's adversary on its behalf and at the Philippines' own expense, is only the most recent chapter in a long, sad story of Washington's abuse and exploitation of the Philippines. The Philippines specifically, and this is a theme that repeats itself all throughout American history. So let's talk about Washington's history of manipulating and abusing the Philippines. Let's take a look here. This is state.gov, the official website of the US State Department, Office of the Historian. Milestones, so milestones in US-Philippine relations, 1899 to 1913, the Philippine-American War. Well, so that doesn't really sound like a very positive milestone in US-Philippine history. Let's read about it. Omitted from pro-Western coverage of the current tensions between the Philippines and China and the supposed threat an expansionist China poses to the Philippines is the fact that it was the US who actually colonized the Philippines from 1899 to 1946. So we're always hearing about how China is expansionist and is going to take over all of Asia and then all of the world. But it was actually the United States and its European allies literally colonizing all of these countries, and to this day trying to reassert themselves over the sovereignty of these nations. So they had colonized the Philippines from 1899 to 1946, brutally suppressing a war for independence fought by the Philippine people against American occupation. The US State Department's own Office of the Historian admits US forces, and this is a quote, burned villages, implemented civilian reconcentration policies, put them in concentration camps, and employed torture on suspected guerrillas, so civilians who they thought were guerrillas, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Filipinos. The U.S. State Department's Office of the Historian also discussed a policy of attraction, which was designed to win over key elites and other Filipinos. Even after the U.S. officially recognized Philippine independence in 1946, through first the Central Intelligence Agency and then the National Endowment for Democracy, the U.S. continued a policy of attraction meant to manipulate both the Philippine government and its population to serve U.S. interests at even the expense of their own best interests. While those in the Philippines, including Rappler, claim that the NED is not equivalent to the CIA and that the NED is promoting democracy rather than regime change, the Western media itself over the years has admitted that the NED was created specifically to take over regime change operations previously carried out by the CIA to make such operations more politically acceptable. And again, this is the Western media admitting to all of this. A 1997 New York Times article titled, this one here, Political Meddling by Outsiders, Not New for US. This was 1997. This is how long this has been going on. And this was back when the Western media would admit this occasionally. This article would discuss the role the NED plays in US interference around the globe and specifically in regards to China itself. The article would admit Congress routinely appropriates tens of millions of dollars in covert and overt money to use in influencing domestic policies abroad. That is the definition of political interference. It is illegal under the UN Charter. It's a violation of a targeted nation's political independence. The National Endowment for Democracy, created 15 years ago, remember, 1997, to do in the open what the Central Intelligence Agency had done covertly for decades, spends $30 million a year to support things like political parties, labor unions, dissident movements, and the news media in dozens of countries, including China. So we always hear about how Russia and China are backing opposition movements in the West. This is an admission that the West is doing this as a matter of policy and specific amounts of money that they allot to do this. More recently, The Guardian in 2004, people following my work are very familiar with this article by now because it's just such a glaring and direct, transparent admission to what the US is really doing in these countries, hijacking them and getting them to pursue US interests at their own peril. US campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev, 2004. The campaign is an American creation. They're talking about the protests in Kiev, trying to overthrow the government at the time. a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries in 4 years, so not just in Ukraine, has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. Funded and organized by the US government, deployed US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, the 2 big American parties, and US non-government organizations. By that they mean the NED, which is actually a US government organization, created, funded, and overseen by the US government. The campaign was first used in Europe, in Belgrade, in 2000 to beat Slobodan Milosevic at the ballot box, to overthrow his government by rigging and influencing the elections. They also talk about Georgia in 2003. They also talk about Belarus. And of course, in 2003 in Georgia, they did manage to overthrow the government. They militarized, NATOized it. And then in 2008, according to the EU's own investigation of the conflict, Georgia attacked Russia first, precipitating the war in 2008, which led to a catastrophic Georgian defeat. And then the US repeated the whole process in Ukraine again in 2014. And this is what precipitated the Russian special military operation in response. Let's look at this other article, also from the New York Times. 2011, remember the Arab Spring. US groups helped nurture Arab uprisings. And again, in this article, they talk all about the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republic Institute, National Democratic Institute, USAID, Freedom House. And then they also even talk about Google and Facebook, US-based social media platforms, working directly with the State Department years in advance, preparing so-called activists to go back to the respective countries and overthrow them. That is what actually happened during the so-called Arab Spring from 2011 onward. And we can see how the wars precipitated by that instability have destroyed entire countries, from North Africa to the Middle East. It is not that the NED has previously engaged in regime change, it's that the NED itself is a regime change organization, and those receiving funding from the NED play a role in undermining a nation's sovereignty and aiding the US in politically capturing that nation. It shouldn't be a surprise then that US-funded organizations lying about public health or national security threats would also lie about their own funding and their relationship to those in Washington providing it. So that's why you will see Rappler in the Philippines claiming that President Duterte's accusations that they are working for the CIA, that's false, because they actually work for the NED. But you saw the New York Times itself admit that the NED just took over CIA-backed regime change. It was just outsourced to the NED. It's a subsidiary or adjacent to the CIA, and it's doing the exact same sort of political interference, illegal political interference that the CIA was involved in. So they're playing semantics to cover up their role in facilitating foreign interference. That's why many countries are shutting the NED down and uprooting the organizations receiving funding from it, because they are a national security threat. It is not the promotion of freedom, democracy, and human rights. It is political interference under the guise, the very thin guise, of promoting human rights, freedom, and democracy. I said we can objectively prove that even if the people in the Philippines think fighting a war with China somehow benefits them, objectively it does not. It is hurting their own best interests. It can be objectively concluded that it is not in the Philippines' best interest to escalate an ordinary maritime dispute. By the way, this shoal that the Philippines is preparing to go to war with China over, and then will completely lose and be destroyed by China in the process, is a rusty old World War II ship stranded on a semi-submerged shoal. Has absolutely no value at all whatsoever. It is purely political, and it is only being emphasized because the government in power right now in Manila was told to do so by Washington to help advance US foreign policy objectives, not the Philippines' best interests. So it is objectively not in the Philippines' best interest to escalate an ordinary maritime dispute with China into a potential conflict involving the US military on Philippine shores and along its coastlines, and ultimately serving Washington's open ambitions to contain China. Looking at the Philippines trade, according to, this is a very useful resource. This is the Harvard University Atlas of Economic Complexity. We select the country or entity. This is the Philippines. We look at exports by partner. You can see that over 30% of Philippine exports go to China, considering Hong Kong is part of China. And it is more than the Philippines sends exports to both North America and Europe combined. You can see it right there, comparable or more. In terms of imports, it's even more stark. Just outright China, 32%. Again, dwarfing both North America and Europe. Clearly, obviously, indisputably dwarfing both North America and Europe, which includes the United States, obviously. So looking at trade, 30% of Philippine exports go to China, while only 14%, less than half, go to the US. 32% of all Philippine imports come from China, to only 6% coming from the United States. Thus starting a war over a grounded World War II ship on a submerged shoal with its largest trade partner serve the Philippines' best interests? Or does it serve Washington's interests at the expense of the Philippines? The South China Morning Post article already illustrated how badly needed public infrastructure has literally been torn down in exchange for escalating tensions with the Philippines' largest trade partner, China. One needs not guess where this will lead the Philippines if it continues to serve US interests by escalating tensions with China, because the same process is already well underway in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the US successfully poisoned the population against Russia through likewise US government-funded media and political organizations. Again, the 2004 Guardian article admits that the US has been doing this for years and years in Ukraine, through the National Endowment for Democracy, just as they are now in the Philippines. The US installed into power a pro-Washington government, militarized Ukraine, and aided in precipitating a conflict with neighboring Russia, resulting in a self-destructive war Ukraine is irreversibly losing. Does anyone doubt that that is exactly how this will play out if the Philippines continues to follow in Ukraine's footsteps toward the cliff of US proxy war? The US is repeating this process in the Philippines. It spends money funding organizations like Rappler to convince ordinary people otherwise looking out for their own best interests to choose war over economic opportunities, real development, infrastructure spending, better healthcare, and better education. It requires constant effort to convince people that somehow hating and confronting their largest, most important economic partner on behalf of their former colonial master is somehow in their best interests. But if you have the time and resources, it can be done. That is the problem with Western-style democracy, or the genius of Western-style democracy. By forcing nations to adopt a system of Western-style democracy, the US is ensuring that it has access to that population, can manipulate them to serve their interests at the expense of their own interests. It's either diabolical or ingenious, depending on your perspective. Let's talk about genuinely defending sovereignty. This is a point that I always make at the end of articles like this. I don't just tell you about the problem, I tell you about how this problem can be solved. Nations in the region, here in Southeast Asia, must secure not only their own borders with armies, their shores with navies, and their airspace with air forces, but they also must secure their information space, political space, academic and cultural space, all from foreign infiltration and capture. The price is just as high as when a foreign nation breaches these spaces as when they breach borders, shores, and airspaces. So just think about what's happening in Ukraine right now. We're talking about an invasion by Russian forces, or an intervention, again, depending on your perspective. The fact that the US precipitated this conflict, whatever you want to call it specifically, demonstrates how important it is to protect your political, information, academic, and cultural space. If Ukraine was not overthrown in 2014 by the US, they would not have been put on this path to self-destruction in this proxy war. If you remember, before 2014, all of what Kiev now claims as Ukrainian territory was firmly under Kiev's control then. They were doing business with Russia. They were doing business with the West. Things then were relatively ideal compared to where they are right now and to wherever they may go in the future. So failure to defend your country from this type of invasion in your information, academic, cultural spaces is just as deadly as just an outright all-out invasion by an army, an air force, or a navy. Bills should be passed to prohibit foreign interference, banning the NED and other foreign-funded organizations and political parties. Investments should be made in creating genuine local media outlets. Academia should be made up of qualified professors with real-world skills to teach students how to build up their nation, not divide and destroy it. Culture should be preserved, celebrated, and added to, rather than undermined, defamed, and erased. And this is something the US actively does all around the globe. A nation that has a military to secure their physical domains, but has left all other domains unprotected, even overrun by foreign influence and interference, have failed just as badly as if they failed to stop an outright military invasion. Again, what I was just talking about, and as Ukraine demonstrates on a daily basis now. Ukraine is a living, or more accurately, dying example of what failure to genuinely protect a nation looks like. While people in the Philippines are meant to believe China is a threat and that fighting against China is in their best interest, the fact that they've been turned against China in the first place means they've already lost to foreign invasion, not by China, but by their old and now renewed colonial rulers in Washington, and not along their shores, but within their information and political spaces. And that is the end of the article. And I just want to add that I've talked previously about programs like YSEALI, run by the US State Department, the Young Southeast Asia Leadership Initiative, where they take promising young individuals, they bring them to the United States, and essentially they brainwash them. And then they send them back to their country, knowing that they're going to have a good probability of working their way into a prominent position in the media, in the government, in industry. And they will always have that connection, that tie back to the United States and the networks the United States connected them to during this process of brainwashing them through programs like YSEALI or the Fulbright Scholarship. They have a diplomatic exchange run by Asia Society, which has nothing to do with Asia. It's the United States and their interests in Asia. That's what the Asia Society exists to advance. And what they do is they get young diplomats from all over Asia, and they bring them to the United States, and they do the exact same thing. They brainwash them. They overwhelm them with how important they're made to feel. They create this relationship, these connections with the United States, and then when they go back to serve in their role as a diplomat for their country, what are they thinking about when they're confronted with a decision between standing up to US exploitation and abuse or getting another chance to go on a field trip to the US and being wowed and wined and dined and brought to all of these spectacular places that they were, talking about how they always dreamed as kids of going to see? What are they going to pick? And you don't have to guess. Just look at Ukraine. Just look at the government in the Philippines right now. Look at certain aspects of the political opposition here in Thailand or in Myanmar being burned to the ground right now by pro-US, US-backed opposition groups. The US State Department itself, in its own documents published publicly, this annual report under the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs brags about the impact of their exchange programs. And if you go down here, they explain the accomplishments. So these alumni of these programs, they go on to take important positions within their respective governments or media or business communities. So here, government and politics, 33 current foreign ambassadors to the United States are alumni of the US government exchange program. 32 alumni currently sit on the respective country's Supreme Court. More than 2,600 alumni have served as a cabinet minister for their national government, and the list goes on. And you can see in the science and humanities, sports, civil society, young leaders. This goes back to the YSEALI program, Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative. And you go down here. The whole point of this is to bring these young people to the United States and begin the process of indoctrination, convincing them that US interests are their own interests and that pursuing them instead of their own nation's best interests should be their primary central organizing principle when they go to work within their respective countries, whether it's in the media or in the government. This is a process that imperialism has carried out for generations, centuries and centuries, and it is something that the modern empire that the United States constitutes is still doing today. You need to know about this. People need to know about this. They need to talk about it, and they need to demand from their government protection from it. Again, no matter how powerful your Army, Navy, and Air Force is, if you're not protecting yourself from this type of invasion, securing these other domains is irrelevant, as we have seen over and over again. So I will end it there. I will continue focusing on this topic as well as the various proxy wars the US successfully implements through this process. I will continue talking about all of this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I highly suggest people follow me on Telegram. Absolutely everything is posted on Telegram, including backups of all my videos. I am now also uploading all of my videos on YouTube to Rumble manually, and often I will release them earlier than YouTube. So follow me on Rumble, just in case. You know, YouTube can censor me at any time. Check the video description for all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of these platforms that my work is on. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been supporting my work, whether it's a one-time donation, whether it's donations month to month, or even if you have no extra resources and you're just helping share my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what helps me do this work. So thank you, and as always, thank you for watching.